Hey guys, and welcome back. So today is May 18th, and we are going to talk about the Gwangju Uprising. And today we're just going to try to explain it in a really easy to understand format and go over why it really has a lot of relevance to today. So May 18th, in Gwangju, which is in the southern part of Korea towards the western region, in the Jeolla-do region. It's essentially the main city, the main capital of the Jeolla-do province. That area had an uprising against military rule and military dictatorship in 1980. If you need an analogy in the West, some people call it Korea's Tiananmen Square. But of course, it happened way before Tiananmen Square. And just as an aside, I think all you people in America really need to stop saying Asians don't speak up, they're meek and quiet, they don't protest. Well, in Asia, they protest too much, okay? Because that's why they get killed, they get shot, all in the name of protest, democracy, and maybe that's a lot of the time why they flee to America, because they protested too much and they have a target on their back in their home country, so they had to go to America. If you are for the Gwangju Uprising in terms of remembering it, you're labeled as a leftist. If you don't want to talk about the Gwangju Uprising and you're just like, let's just let the past be the past, then you're labeled as a far-right extremist. So that's why you don't have a lot of people talking about the May 18th uprising a lot in this current age, but it's almost like disclosing your age or income or political affiliation if you are so open about this May 18th event, which I think is a very unfortunate thing in Korea because it really bypasses this opportunity for a day of atonement. So let's go over how this bloody 10-day siege happened. So if you're a fan of like Les Miserables and like the French Revolution and people in your city banding together against an evil force or an oppressive force, well, this happened in 1980 in Korea. So how did we get to this moment? Well, in modern Korean history in the 20th century, you could say that democracy itself was a dream deferred for almost 100 years, ever since the fall of the Joseon dynasty, and then immediately moving right into Japanese imperialism, that was deferred democracy. Then moving into the modern age after World War II ended, and then right before the Korean War, we had essentially an installed dictatorship under the guise of democracy with Lee Seung-man.
200,000 persons in Seoul Stadium hear members of the opposition Democratic Party campaign for election. South Korea is going to the polls to choose a president and vice president. As this huge rally would suggest, voter interest runs high, though not to the benefit of the Democratic Party. A record turnout of almost 95% of the eligible voters gives an overwhelming fourth-term victory to President Syngman Rhee and his Liberal Party running mate Lee Ki-pung. Though Rhee is unopposed, his opponent having died last month in Washington, the one-sided outcome in the vice presidential contest points to clear-cut support for Rhee. Almost 85 years old, Rhee is shown at the polls early on Election Day. He wins another 4 years at the helm. Events move toward a violent climax in South Korea. With the tide turning against the government, rioting students hurl stones at the home of Vice President-elect Lee Ki-pung. He is held mainly responsible for the rigging of the March elections. Rightly or wrongly, he becomes the chief object of the crowd's fury. As this demonstration takes place, Lee and his family have found safe refuge in the presidential compound. Daylight reveals what is left of the house of the vice president-elect. Soon afterward, the end comes for Lee Ki-pung. Shown here talking to newsmen after his election, 63-year-old Lee was ailing and could not walk unaided. He said he sought office only because he was needed by his old friend and political associate, President Syngman Rhee. Now, with Rhee out and Lee disgraced, a suicide pact wipes out Lee's family. Foreign Minister Chung becomes acting president, while a saddened President Rhee goes into retirement.
President Rhee has gone from the political scene, thrust out by the revolt of the people. It amounts to revolution in southern Korea. Even while thousands mourned in Seoul, the capital, Syngman Rhee turned his police on the rebels and thought he could ride the storm. In a lifetime of struggle, he'd always come out on top. This time, the grief was too deep. The people could stand no more.
A military coup d'etat by General Pak Jonghee. Pak Jonghee was President Park Geun-hye's father. So Pak Jonghee, in the name of democracy, to fight against corruption, then he himself, for 18 years, became a dictator. So he became a dictator, and people in 1979 started really just having a lot of student protests around Korea, and there were plans being made to really suppress a lot of these protests, and to the point where they would be very bloody and very high human costs, essentially killing a lot of your own people in order to quell dissent. Just to sum up the frustration in a nutshell, to fast forward like 18 years of Korean history during the Pak Jonghee regime, the reason why a lot of people were upset is that earlier in the 1970s, Pak Jonghee just reformed the constitution so that he set it up where the game was rigged in his favor, that he could essentially rule for the rest of his life. He was just going to be a dictator for life, and it would still look sort of like a democracy, but he would still be able to choose enough of the who the people were in the National Assembly so that he could also control the National Assembly. And so that was called the Yushin Constitution. And by 1979, especially the college students had a lot of issues with Pak Jong-hee's regime, and they really wanted to put democracy into effect. So that's why you saw a lot of revolts happening, especially among the college student age protests. So the thing is, the protests started with the college campuses, and even the CIA, when they were analyzing Korea, thought that it was limited towards just, kids wanting to be free and having all these ideas in their head, maybe about democracy or something they read about in America. But actually, it turned out that families, mothers, fathers, like the general public started coalescing and wanted this as well. And so it started getting a lot of mainstream appeal. But what really threw a monkey wrench into this scenario, and what could have really accelerated democracy in South Korea, was that Pak Jonghee got assassinated. And who assassinated him? On October 26, 1979. So remember, 1979 was like the year of the riots. His own director of the Korean CIA, Kim JaeGyu. He was also a friend, also one of his close colleagues that helped him with the coup d'etat to usher in this new era of democracy, back in 1961. So Kim JaeGyu, in a nutshell, just to fast forward, he's presented as one of the president's, inner circle, but that guy, that friend that's always like the guy that's trying to calm down, that friend that always is aggressive, like, hey, maybe you want to not, kill your own people in order to solidify power. Now, Kim JaeGyu had a rivalry with another one of President Pak Jong-hee's inner circle. You know, like one of those new friends that worms their way into the crowd, and he's always like telling the, you know, the leader like, hey, yeah, you know what? Your old friend, he sucks. He doesn't know what he's doing, and we should just go out and kill everybody and like show them who's boss. So essentially there was that kind of an atmosphere going on. Kim JaeGyu was really upset that Pak Jonghee had turned into a dictator and turned into the person that they were fighting against, and they did not achieve the goals that they were trying to implement in Korea, which was a democracy. So there is a debate about the reasons why he went and assassinated his own friend and his own colleague and his own, you know, lifelong compatriot in Korea. But he basically went to a dinner party and he just shot him dead. And of course, he shot, you know, the guy that he was having a rivalry with. He probably enjoyed that one, but he shot the president. And so there was a power vacuum. So October 26, 1979, that's when the president was assassinated. And so there was a little bit of confusion of what the succession was, because remember, Pak Jonghee had reformed the constitution so that he could essentially be president for life. So they didn't really know how to, you know, deal with a situation like this. So during this time, November essentially, of really kind of confusion of how Korea had to move forward with a new leader, they still had to take care of this question of the assassination. So the army chief of staff, Chung Seung-hwa, had appointed General Chun Doo-hwan, who was also part of this long-standing inner circle, to lead an investigation over the assassination. Basically try to wrap things up and do the investigation and make sure that the public was comfortable with, like, you know, point the finger at Kim JaeGyu and, you know, wrap things up. But now this is the important part. This is the link of how we got to the Gwangju Uprising. Because Chun Doo-hwan becomes the president. But how did he get from, you know, general of just doing the investigation of the assassination to becoming the president? Well, this is where he played the major chess move. So he was, okay, going to investigate. Well, he was investigating the assassin. Who was the assassin? The leader of the Korean CIA. Therefore, he goes to the Korean CIA and says, look, yo, your leader killed the president. Therefore, I have to investigate the entire organization. Therefore, if you want to spend any money, I have to approve it. And if you want to release any sort of intelligence briefings, I have to get it first. So what he did was essentially in one move control the intelligence organizations of the entire nation. In order to investigate, he set up his own organization, his investigation committee, which essentially is creating a shadow government. So it's sort of like creating his own cabinet and the formation of his own team. So right now, just from his job of investigating the assassination, he captured the intelligence arm of Korea. So what did he do next? Well, remember who gave him the job of being the lead investigator? It was the Army Chief of Staff, Chung Seung-hwa. Now, Chung Seung-hwa was sort of close to the former CIA director, but he didn't follow along fully with the former CIA director. He was trying to be neutral. In the end, that sort of cost him because Chun Doo-hwan went against the guy who gave him this job and said, look, I think you are part of this whole thing, and you are also going to go and suffer for this crime. So he basically took over in that move the military. So in these two strong chess moves, he was able to capture the control over Korea's intelligence agency and Korea's military arm. Now, how do you justify yourself as a leader in the military? Well, then he gave himself a promotion in rank. in the military. So then I guess he became high enough of a rank in the military to be the leader of the military. And then he also made himself the director of the Korean CIA. So he legitimately had the titles now to lead both organizations. And remember, even in America, they really did not believe in combining intelligence and military. They thought that was a very volatile, dangerous combination. And yet, there we go. Chun Doo-hwan had combined it, merged it, and put it into himself. And there was no real president at that moment. So like I said, remember, there was an acting president who was the prime minister that adopted the role in early December. Chun Doo-hwan had orchestrated all of this coup 6 days later, December 12th. He didn't make this prime minister, leave his post, but it became very clear that, probably soon this guy would have to probably get out of the way for Chun Doo-hwan to come in. But in order for this to happen, the Korean public had to go along on board. And right now, the Korean public was all up in arms. So what did Chun Doo-hwan do? He ramped up military martial law. So he spread out his forces because now he controlled the military. So all these military forces went throughout the country. And so like in your neighborhood, it's as if you had an invading force. It's as if you're being monitored, you're being controlled, and you're being abused a lot of the time by military forces from your own country. So he was trying to make sure that there would be no dissent. So he's clearing a path for him to become the new dictator. Also, the third big chess move to justify even himself moving into the presidential office was he was saying, you know what, there's a lot of instability and North Korea has designs on us, because he's the director now of the Central Intelligence Agency, and he can say, we've picked up reports that North Korea has plans to take advantage of this vulnerable situation. You need me to, protect us. So he really took advantage of the situation. Later on, we've seen unclassified documents that have been released saying that North Korea did not have any plans and really kind of the capability to attack at that time. But the fear was trumped up so that he could really then even physically put himself into the presidential office. This is before he even declared himself or kicked out the person who was even being the interim president. So by the time we get to May 17th, remember May 18th is the holiday, May 17th, martial law is declared across all of Korea. And over in Gwangju, they just weren't having it. The next day, May 18th, they're just like, no, thank you, sir. So what the residents there did was they basically stole a bunch of weapons wherever they could, like at the police station or wherever they found storage, and they created their own militia. And they started saying, look, we are going to oppose you, and you being the military forces. If you want to get a sense of how bad martial law was, what happened? Well, martial law closed universities. You couldn't go to class because class is where you got all these dangerous ideas to oppose dictators. They banned political activities. Press freedoms were crushed. They also, like I said, had all of the military personnel in every part of the nation. And also the Korean Central Intelligence Agency would raid student union leaders, and they would arrest politicians and people suspected of being, contrary to the political regime. Okay, so back to Gwangju. So even the public transportation bus drivers and taxi drivers took part in, creating this parade or blockade and transporting the injured to the hospital. So that's why you get that movie, Taxi Driver, about the whole Gwangju uprising. It really was like this collective force of the city coming together. And it was notable, and it is notable because they say it's like the first time that citizenry really stood up to the modern dictatorship. We had uprisings against the Japanese imperialistic forces till then in modern Korean history, but not against the Korean dictatorships. So that required a lot of courage and balls to really go forward with. So more and more protesters joined, and as it escalated, more and more military personnel, paratroopers, came into the city of Gwangju. Gwangju had been now blockaded. It had been blocked off even in terms of its communication, but still news of Gwangju leaked out, and there were protests happening in other parts of Korea, but Gwangju was the hot center. And so the military started ramping up their firepower against the citizens. Now, this is where it gets to be tragic and long-lasting in terms of the pain and the trauma inflicted upon the nation, and especially the residents of Gwangju and that region. The main issue at hand is that the government, especially the Chun Doo-hwan government, has never apologized or even acknowledged the atrocities. And the major point that has been brought up is that there were helicopters sent in and soldiers spraying the public and a building in particular with gunfire. And it had always been denied. But even that building had been turned into a museum where they preserved the markings of the bullets that hit the building. And, the whole forensic detailing had been preserved because there's been so much denial. And not only, of course, you're not going to get to an apology if they'd even denied that it happened. So that has been just a major trauma, just trying to get even the acknowledgement that something so horrific happened where you would send in helicopters to mow down your own people in order to enforce a coup d'etat. That has been the main thing. And then in 2018, under the Moon Jae-in administration, there was a committee to investigate, and they confirmed that there indeed was firepower from helicopters on 2 days that had killed people. So that's the first big trauma. The second big trauma, and if you're wondering, if you're in America and you're like, wow, we really have to support the democracy movement in other countries, and, if you want to associate with some of the Gwangju uprising people, you should. Well, here's a little bit of a warning, because this uprising actually created anti-American sentiment. Why? Because the Carter administration, the American government at the time, supported the use of the military troops to quell the uprising. So when people in Gwangju heard about that, they were so upset that America would side with another military dictatorship. Now, you have to understand at the time, America had a very long-standing tradition, particularly from the push of the policies set by a lot of the CIA to support dictatorships in a lot of countries in the name of stability. They're always this excuse that, we have to go with the snake we know instead of some sort of unknown instability. From that American perspective, that foreign policy perspective of America, is that you never want an uncertainty to fall into a situation where either communism gets installed or a regime gets installed that essentially hurts American business interests. And so, as long as you have somebody who can keep things stable pretty much, even a strongman, even, a dictatorship, America will just go along with. They'll just also say, hey, it's not our country, we're not going to get involved. But in any event, if you do see how people who are involved in the democracy movement in Korea are also a little bit, when they meet an American, they're like a little bit angry with you, then understand that even though you may think as an American you are a symbol of democracy around the world, well, sometimes in Korea you are not a symbol of that. You are actually a symbol of why maybe some of their relatives actually died. Maybe a symbol of why they've been carrying around a lot of hurt for decades and never got an apology. So just keep that in mind, and know that that might be what you might be walking into. And of course, you can always find a common ground, but know that that's the situation you might be facing. So towards the end of this 10-day siege, there were negotiations between the militia and also the government, but it didn't work out. And then the government made a huge push. They had like 5 divisions of the army just go into Gwangju, and in 90 minutes it was done. I mean, a militia, really can't compete with the firepower of a nation's army, especially when it is operated by a dictator who was a general and seems to be a master chess player in terms of knowing how to grab power. So I wanted to bring up the Gwangju Uprising in this context because I think it gets a little bit lost when we're talking about, whether the bullets came from the helicopter and whether they went to the building and whatnot. Because its role, its sacrifice in this larger context was that it really was a lost generation for democracy yet again. For Chun Doo-hwan and his dictatorship, it was like clearing the path towards his ascendancy, and Gwangju got in the way, and he had to hit it down. And I think we have to see how huge traumatic events are actually just seen as speed bumps to people who are tyrants and dictators. So something that can really scar you for life is seen almost as nothing to somebody who is just on a ruthless path. So for the people in the Gwangju uprising, it really was a moment where they just wanted to say no more, because they had to wait 18 years. 1961, they put their faith behind Pak Jonghee, who led the revolution against Lee Seung-man, to say like, okay, we're going to bring in democracy into Korea, and then it became a dictatorship. And then they were like, oh wow, we have this moment in time. It was not even 6 months until they were sprayed down with bullets by another military junta to lead in another military regime. And they just wanted to say no more. They didn't want to wait again. Langston Hughes, his famous poem, A Dream Deferred, what happens to a dream deferred? It dries up like a raisin in the sun. Essentially, if you have this hope that is carried for so long without coming into fruition, it really turns into like this festering infected wound. Every May 18th is an opportunity for us to drain some of that pus and to really start to heal it. But if we just kind of fly over it because it creates an uncomfortable political situation or conversation in today's language, we really are foregoing an important opportunity to, really honor kind of a a really badass time in Korean history where people really stood up. And then also see what happened when you retreated and went along. When you kind of gave up on that courage. Or if you let that resentment kind of warp itself into actually something ugly. So some of the, I'd say the progressive liberal camp that comes out of that generation has been really traumatized, and you see them now, they're not so functional, in my opinion, in terms of their, liberal progressive policies. But I think that happens because we're not taking this time to kind of filter, refresh, and really reflect on what has happened in the past, and to really see what happens when you let military dictatorships just come right in. So this is also, I think, really applicable to what's going on in Myanmar right now, because you're seeing the military junta yet again go in. You thought you had a chance with Aung San Suu Kyi, and then yet again the military junta took over. So when is their moment? When is their, never again line going to be drawn? And then in the United States, dictatorships like this, the military dictatorships, they know to test the waters, and they know the critical areas to erode for them to get in, infiltrate, take over, and then, just like a good chess player, make the final siege. And then ordinary people are like, oh my god, what happened? It's like suddenly the world changed overnight. It didn't change overnight. The people who are trying were working in steps all along the way. So the Capitol siege, January 6th, that was another testing of the waters. They were chanting Mike Pence's name, figurehead of the Senate, who was certifying the vote for the next president in the Senate chamber, and then they were chanting the name of Nancy Pelosi, the leader of the House of Representatives. You capture both of those people, you essentially cripple the legislative branch of the United States, the people's voice in the government, the people's countervailing force to the executive branch. Executive branch gobbles up the legislative branch, and then you saw Trump installing his people into the Supreme Court. Somebody with perhaps better ability could definitely pick up in terms of a roadmap that Trump has established and do much better the next time. May 1980 was not that long ago, and yes, Korea has changed, it's developed a lot, it's different, but even in 1980, Korea was not like a state run by a warlord or a banana republic. On the surface, it looked like a modern, capitalistic democracy that was against its communist neighbor to the north, and yet it had been ruled by a military dictatorship since 1961. Then another military dictator had overthrown the government and was about to rule again until 1988, and even brought the Seoul Summer Olympics. A military dictator can also have a nice package too. So you gotta be careful. Okay, so hopefully that was an easy way to understand the steps that led up to the Gwangju Uprising and its role in how it facilitated the steps for Chun Doo-hwan to become the next military dictator of South Korea. And that came to an end in 1988. And fast forward, the ending of his life, career, well, he's still alive, but he went to jail, then he got released, and he got fined about like $200 million, but they're still trying to collect the money because he was really good at supposedly hiding it. He says he doesn't have like a dime. But I don't know. But people are like, well, how do you pay the bills on your really nice house? So take time to honor those people who really sacrificed their lives for democracy and who still do. See you next time. Bye.
Tune in next time. Don't forget to subscribe. Find us on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Love you.